that are to give us, to remind us, or that become a certain archetypal behaviors or conflicts that he's dealing with, that will really be conflicts and issues that we will deal with as the Jewish people as we move on into our history. So first, let's take a look and see where it all begins. And it begins in chapter 41, verse 16. Okay, and here Joseph, of course, has been in prison, and it was he's brought before Pharaoh for the first time because he developed a reputation in prison for being very good at figuring out what dreams mean, and he had successfully solved the dreams of the baker and the person in charge of drinks for Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh has had a dream, and he is at a loss as to what it means, and his various ministers and magicians are not able to solve the problem. So one of the ministers there, of course, remembers Joseph, and he brings him out of the prison, and he comes before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh starts to tell him, I hear you're a good dream interpreter. This is my dream, okay? And what is the first thing Joseph says, even before he hears the dream? The first thing he says, almost as if he's interrupting Pharaoh, because Pharaoh says to him, and this is verse 15, he says to him, listen to a dream so that you can solve it. And before he even gets a chance to say, okay, and here's my dream, Joseph interrupts him. And he says, not me. It is God who is going to respond, who's going to look after Pharaoh's welfare. So from the very first encounter that he has with Pharaoh, he, on the one hand, seems fairly confident in his ability to stand before Pharaoh and provide a solution, but at the same time, he is very determined to make sure Pharaoh understands it is not him. He is not the one who is solving these dreams. It is God. And then he moves onward as he's starting to, now he's about to solve the dream. And chapter 21, he repeats the same thing. He says, God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. He's telling the nature of the dream. And then essentially what Joseph is saying is this is a prophetic dream. God has, through this dream, told Pharaoh what he can expect in the years to come. But of course, he needs Joseph to interpret and to make sure that Pharaoh understands the message. And then again, in verse 28, he says, this is what I have said to Pharaoh. What God is doing, he has shown to Pharaoh. And again, I think this shows something very important about Joseph. First of all, he is a vehicle that God chooses to bring prophecy to Pharaoh. And at the same time, he makes sure he's in a position of unbelievable potential. He's standing before Pharaoh, who was, I would say, one of the most powerful people in the ancient world. Egypt wasn't just a country, it was an empire, and it actually reigned over most of the Middle East at that time. And he in doing this, doesn't let the situation go to his head. We don't see a bit of arrogance here, but rather constant deference to the fact that it is God who is the one who's giving him this wisdom. And yet Joseph goes beyond interpreting the dream. He actually adds his own advice. He tells him what he wants to, the dream, of course, is that there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And then Joseph, of his own accord, comes forward with a suggestion of how to store up reserves during the 7 years of plenty so that they will have enough food to feed everybody during the years of famine. And then, of course, Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph, both by his successful interpretation of the dream and of his advice, that he says as follows, and this is in verse 39. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is none so discerning as wise as you. So, and then of course he appoints him to be his second in command. So it's very interesting. It's not just that Joseph is constantly referring to God, but he has brought Pharaoh to a situation where even he recognizes that it is God who is giving Joseph the wisdom, and he is choosing Joseph to be a second in command because he recognizes him as being an appointed one of God. But then we have another element that enters into this equation, and this we see in verse 45. Pharaoh then gave Joseph the name Sofnat Paneach, and he gave him for a wife Osnat, the daughter of Potiphera, a priest of On. Clearly here, Pharaoh is taking a step. On the one hand, he's going with Joseph. Joseph keeps talking about God. Pharaoh says, okay, God is behind this. God is wise. You are therefore someone we need. But yet it becomes very important to Pharaoh to turn Joseph into an Egyptian. And so he changes his name. This name, Sofnat Paneach, it's not a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian name. And he gives him an Egyptian wife, and not just any Egyptian wife, the daughter of a priest. This would be nobility, okay? So here for the first time, essentially Joseph is going to start facing a very difficult challenge. On the one hand, he's not afraid, he has never been ashamed to stand out and be different. He is standing in Egypt where they worship idols, they worship animals, they have completely different faith system. They trust their magicians, who of course have failed them. So he's been very good about that and standing out and saying, well, you know, I'm coming to you from a different perspective. I'm coming to you in the name of the God of Israel. But on the other hand, Pharaoh is bringing him in to a sort of assimilation process. He's changing his name and he's giving him a wife who is Egyptian. And the question then becomes, and I think that here starts what has to be for Joseph a situation of ongoing conflict. Who is he? Now let's remember that Joseph has been abandoned by his family. He has been sold as a slave to Egypt. He has left the land of Canaan. He has been in prison. He has suffered terribly. He is not an Egyptian. He is a Hebrew, but you know, his family is seemingly completely turned his back on him. He probably doesn't even know what's going on with Jacob. Is Jacob alive or what's happening? And you know, he's in the dark. You know, there's no phone and there's no email and there's no Google that he can say, okay, what's Jacob up to these days, and see where his name has appeared in the local newspaper. You know, he really has no idea. So in a way, he's been cut off from his family and his roots, and yet he has steadfastly stuck to his faith. On the other hand, if we look at identity, identity is not just a question of faith. It's a question of who is your people group? What is your culture? What is your country? And here, Pharaoh is going out of his way to try to pull him in to the Egyptian orbit. Now, it's very interesting then, if we look further, we see a reflection of this at the very end of the chapter in verses 51 and 52. Joseph not only has an Egyptian wife, but that Egyptian wife now gives him 2 children. And look at the names. Look, he gives the names, of course, Manasseh and Ephraim, but what is the reasoning behind each name? The reasoning behind the first name, Manasseh, is God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. He is saying, I'm cut off. I was in pain, I was sad, but now I've put that all behind me. An even greater separation than before. And then in the next verse, and the second he named Ephraim, meaning God has made me more fertile in the land of my affliction. So he's come to a point now where in terms of his land, first it was the family, now the land. He's saying, I have found a home in a different land. I am in Egypt and I'm doing well. I'm doing much better here than I was doing before. Okay? So there are many people, and I find this very interesting, there are people who have compared Joseph to Mordecai. Mordecai, the hero of the book of Esther. And if you just read the book of Esther on its face and you get swept into the story, and the way, of course, we tell the story as we celebrate the holiday of Purim. No, I'm not confused. I know now it's Hanukkah, Purim is in a few months, but you know, the comparison is really interesting. Okay, Mordecai, it seems like a typical story. Pardon? Okay, it seems it seems like a typical story that unfortunately repeats itself throughout Jewish history, that the Jews are in danger and there's someone who's out to kill them all. And then Mordecai, as the leader of the Jews, manages to get himself into a position of power together with his niece Esther. And the two of them, convince the king to reverse the decree. Okay. But if you think about it, if you analyze carefully what we know about Mordecai, and we don't have a lot of information, but there is one thing we do know. We know Mordecai's name and we know Esther's name. Mordecai and Esther are Persian names, named for Persian gods. Mordecai is named for Marduk, and Esther is named for Ishtar. These are Babylonian and Persian gods. Now, there's no question that Mordecai and Esther are not idol worshipers. They are not worshiping these pagan gods. However, if you ask me, what is my name, what am I telling you? Sondra. Sondra is not a Hebrew name. Sondra is actually a name that comes from, there's somebody talking, I think. Somebody, I'm hearing noises, so maybe mute if, I don't know who it is, but anyway. Okay, so Sondra is not a Hebrew name, and it's not biblical, and it has absolutely no roots whatsoever in anything in Jewish history. Its root is in Alexander the Great. Some people say the roots are Cassandra, a Greek prophetess. Now, just because I take these names that are Greek in origin, does that mean I believe in Zeus and all those Greek gods? Absolutely not. When my parents gave me the name Sondra, now I do happen to have a Jewish name as well, but when my parents gave me the name Sondra, it was because I was living in the United States and they wanted to fit in. And I can't say I was ever assimilated in the sense of, I was always dedicated to the faith of Judaism and very active in a Jewish community when I lived in the States. I was very young, of course, when I left for Israel, but that was my existence. But what my name already tells you is that there's a part of me that became very much at home and as part of the general American culture. And we can say the same thing about Mordecai and Esther. Okay, we know Esther has a different name. Esther's name is also Hadassah, which is a totally Hebrew name. It's named for Hadass, which is a myrtle branch. But the two of them are known by their Persian names. So too Joseph. The fact that Joseph is being given an Egyptian name is very, very significant. And it positions Joseph as somebody who is going to be straddling two different worlds. An Egyptian world where he is feeling more and more comfortable, and particularly somebody like Joseph who has more and more power. And yet at the same time, he is going to still stay with his faith. What we do need to see, and I would say the same is true of Mordecai and the same is true of Joseph, both of them will be going through a crisis situation that will then serve to bring them back into the fold of the family. In the case of Mordecai and Esther, of course, it is the threat to the Jewish people, where the two of them, and Esther, of course, is the most hesitant about this because she's fearful for her life. She has a secure position in the king's palace. She doesn't want to make any waves. And she and Mordecai are forced to face a threat to their people and to make a decision. And they make the right decision. They make the decision to stand up on behalf of the Jewish people, regardless of the cost it may be for their position in Persian society. In the case of Joseph, okay, he doesn't face that same kind of risk. But when his brothers come down, he begins to face more and more, this conflict really comes to play. Now, we can follow part of this conflict in this chapter, in this portion. But one of the things we can look at is the extent to which Joseph, as he encounters his brothers on the one hand, and yet is surrounded by the Egyptian court on the other, what his identity looks like to those around him. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 42. Chapter 42, verse 18. Okay, now, until now, we see the brothers have come down. They have appeared before Joseph, and he recognizes them immediately. They do not recognize him. Now, how is it they don't recognize him? He's their brother. So you could say, well, when you're 17 and when you're 39 or whatever he probably was, you don't look the same. But still, you know what? I have met people, and I think I look very different from what I looked at 17, but I'll meet people I haven't seen in many, many years, and they will often recognize me. So it has to be much more than just, he got a bit older. I think first of all, they're seeing him as an Egyptian. He is an Egyptian garb. He probably has an Egyptian haircut. Of course, the fact that he's probably wearing, some kind of a crown or whatever it is they wore in those years in Egypt, sets them off guard because they would never expect to see Joseph in the court of Egypt. But he's dressed and he's speaking Egyptian. Okay. Now this really, and he's seen to be part of the society, and yet here and there he lets something slip. So let's look at verse 18. This right here is when he says he's going to, first he imprisons the whole bunch of them. Of course he's really playing with them and persecuting them a bit. But he, pardon?
Tell her to look at it and call me on the phone.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to go back. Okay. So he has released his brothers now from jail, and he says, okay, I'm going to hold just one of you, and the rest of you go. Don't come back to me if you don't bring Benjamin. And he, of course, wants to assure them that he's not going to harm Simeon. And so what does he say to them in verse 18? He says, on the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you shall live, for I am a God-fearing man. A God-fearing man? What's a God-fearing man doing on the Egyptian throne? This is something that we don't see any hint that the brothers reacted to this like, huh, what? But and he probably said it in a very, calm kind of way, but it's a hint. It's a hint that he kind of releases about who he is. And then in verse 23, when they're, the brothers are talking amongst themselves and they are expressing their remorse, the guilty feelings they have for what they did to Joseph. And what does it say here in verse 23? They did not know that Joseph understood him because there was an interpreter between them. So now we learn for the first time that this whole time Joseph is speaking Egyptian to them. And they speak among themselves in Hebrew, and they don't realize that Joseph also understands Hebrew. So he has purposely set himself up, not just in the way he looks, but he could have been speaking Hebrew to them. No, he's going to play the charade to the end. He is going to make sure they know that, make sure they don't know that he understands who they are. Now, on the other hand, we have a contradictory sort of hit in the next chapter, chapter 43, verse 32. Here, when the brothers come back the second time, and they're being framed by Joseph, and he invites them in, and he's going to have them eat with him. Verse 32, as follows. He said, they served him by himself. That's Joseph. And then by themselves, the brothers, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. For the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. Okay? Now makes perfect sense that the Egyptians and the Hebrews are going to sit separately. Because if the Egyptians find it to be, abhorrent or disgusting or whatever, for them to be eating with anyone who's not an Egyptian, so then it makes sense to keep the brothers on one table and the Egyptians on another table. But why is Joseph separate? This tells me that the Egyptians know darn well he's not Egyptian. Otherwise, he would be sitting at the Egyptian table. But he is sitting separately. Again, this is a hint that the brothers have not picked up on. They may not be quite as attuned to Egyptian culture. But here there's a hint. In other words, Joseph is really in between. He's playing the Egyptian. He's dressed like the Egyptian. He's making sure there's an interpreter between him and his brothers so that he can really play the Egyptian. And yet he sits separately. He doesn't sit with the Egyptians. And of course, he doesn't sit with the Hebrews. And I think in many, many ways, this represents where Joseph is at this point. He is stuck in the middle. He is by himself. He has really never become Egyptians. Even the Egyptians don't really accept him as Egyptian, otherwise they would be sitting with him at the table. But he's really not a Hebrew either, and he's not ready yet to reveal himself to his brothers in order to be reunited. And at the point at which he reveals himself to his brothers, he is not only going to be reunited with his family, he is going to be reunited with his identity. And that, of course, is something we're going to see next week as he reveals himself. And I see this, though, as a similar kind of situation that Mordecai faced. Again, Joseph is not being threatened with his life or with the life of his people, but he has to make a choice. And it is the choice that he is going to make is going to help him resolve his identity. Because it's not, once he reveals himself to his brothers, the word goes out all through Egypt. Joseph's family has arrived. Joseph's family is coming. Joseph's, it becomes very, very clear who Joseph is at that point. And later on, at the end of book of Genesis, when Jacob dies and the entire family goes to accompany him to burial in the land of Canaan, Joseph goes with them. And in this way, he's totally different from no Egyptian king would ever leave Egypt to go and bury somebody in Canaan. But Joseph is able at that point to come into his own skin, and to be at peace again with his identity. And I think we're going to see, and of course, this is something we see later on, but we're not going to deal with it, so I might as well just have you think about it now. When they come, when Joseph when Jacob comes to Joseph, and one thing he sees these two sons, and who are these sons? These are Joseph's sons who were born to him in Egypt. This is how Joseph introduces them. And yet Jacob embraces them. These are children who have an Egyptian mother who could very well have gone the way of the Egyptian. And yet Jacob embraces them. And we see that Joseph himself makes sure that his sons are reunited and that the family identity of him and his sons are back with his family, with the people of Israel. And he is not part of Egypt. He does his duties. He has a job to fulfill, but it is not who he is. I think that very much Joseph represents the archetypal, as Mordecai as well, the archetypal leader of the Jewish people in exile. We see throughout our history when Jews were exiled and in different countries, and sometimes times were good and sometimes times were bad. But when there was always, throughout the generations, Jewish communities who found people from within their midst, Jewish leaders who were able to speak the language, who were able to understand the culture, were able to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people with the dominant culture. And this was always a very important role. The question that arose is when the countries that the Jews were in were more comfortable countries and where there was less persecution. And then the question becomes, is that person who is interacting with the governments and becoming active leader of the Jewish people within a different country, within the exile, does that person represent the Jewish community to the government or to the authorities or to the larger culture? Or at some point, does he become a part of the larger culture, feeling more comfortable there and helping the larger culture reach out to the Jewish community? I just want to end with a very short story. I had a very interesting encounter once, many years ago, when Obama was president of the United States. And in a chance encounter, I was introduced to the person who worked in the White House, who was the liaison on behalf of Obama to the Jewish community in the United States. And I said some nasty things to this fellow about his boss. And it was ridiculous. It became, of course, we didn't like Obama. And I just said, what are you as a Jew doing working for Obama? And it ended up becoming almost like a diplomatic crisis. Okay. This guy complained about me to the representative of the Jewish communities who he was liaison with. And it came back to me, you have to apologize. What did you do? What did you do? I said, me? I'm just me. I'm not representing the state of Israel. This should not be a diplomatic whatever. But I came home with it was a very disturbing situation, because to me, that fellow who worked for Obama was no longer representing the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. He was representing the American government. And this is not just about what your political values are. I was talking to him Jew to Jew, and he could not understand what I was saying. And this, of course, is the challenge. Joseph rose to the challenge and reunited with his identity and did wonderful things for the Jewish people, for his brothers and for his family. And this, of course, is the challenge that Jews face abroad in exile, always, and still do. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom. I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Shabbat Shalom, Sondra. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy Hanukkah, one last day.
Yes. Amen. Great teaching. Thank you so much. Shalom.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah, do they would she have seen this leader as